the summer of 1993, a small monastery tucked deep in Oregon's pine forests abruptly closed its doors. No warning, no ceremony, just silence. 7 nuns vanished overnight, leaving behind only a single resignation letter and decades of unanswered questions. For years, the case faded into rumor until one woman, driven by a line and a forgotten letter, uncovered what no one was meant to find. The autumn fog rolled down the slopes of Pine Ridge like a silent ghost, covering the small town of Alders Creek in a muted shroud. It was October 17, 1993, a Sunday, and the townsfolk had just emerged from morning mass when the first whispers began. Father Hennessy, a rotund man in his late 50s with a creaky voice and heavy breath, stood at the doors of St. Jude's Chapel, his eyes flicking nervously toward the northern hills. "They didn't show up," he muttered to himself, wiping his glasses. No one had heard from the 7 nuns of Our Lady of the Pines Monastery since Thursday. By Monday, concern became confusion. By Wednesday, fear took its place. Perched in the woods 3 miles outside town, the monastery had always been an odd fixture, a secluded, self-sustaining, fiercely quiet. Its red wick facade and towering pines gave it a reverent solitude that both comforted and unsettled. The nuns were rarely seen in town save for essential errands or occasional medical visits. They were polite, reserved, and almost too well behaved to be noticed. For years, they lived like clockwork, gardening, praying, operating a small apiary, and selling homemade candles at the Alders Creek Farmers Market. So when the postman, Harold Keating, reported the first strange detail, that the mail had gone untouched for 3 days, it raised eyebrows. "They never let it pile up," Harold told Deputy Lemont at the general store, his voice tight with something between worry and guilt. "And someone moved the mailbox. It's off angle, like someone hit it." More disturbing was what he saw Friday night, just before dusk. A dark green Ford pickup, no plates, no lights, parked behind the monastery. 2 men in plain clothes loaded something heavy into the back. No one from town owned a truck like that. The sheriff's office hesitated. The monastery was considered federal ecclesiastical property, meaning civil authorities had limited rights unless invited or unless foul play was clearly evident. Still, a deputy was sent to check in. What he found chilled even the most hardened locals. The gate was locked from the inside. 7 identical rooms were stripped, nearly bare, the beds made, Bibles stacked neatly on the floor. A note lay on the dining table, written in tidy cursive. "We, Sisters of Our Lady of the Pines, resign from our vows effective immediately. The Lord has called us elsewhere." No names, no signatures, just that. By Thursday, the Diocese of Portland dispatched 2 investigators and a legal representative. The entire monastery was declared closed, sealed off with heavy chains, and a posted notice that read, "Religious property, under review." Rumors ran rampant. Some claimed they had seen a woman in habit standing at the edge of the woods that Sunday night, hands clasped, eyes distant. Others swore they heard chanting in the wind the night the truck came. The town was small enough that everyone knew someone who believed in something strange. But Marcy Delano, only 10 years old at the time, remembered one detail differently. Her godmother, Sister Helena, had sent her a postcard on her birthday every year, except that one. Instead, her mother received an envelope in the mail a week after the monastery was closed, postmarked Portland, with no return address. Inside was Marcy's birthday card. The handwriting was familiar but shaky. "To my brave girl, remember the lemon trees." Years later, Marcy would revisit that memory with an ache in her chest, wondering why no one had questioned more, why there were no vigils, why no proper investigation, why 7 women could vanish from a small town and no one, not even the church, asked for justice, only silence. In the following months, speculation died down. Life in Alders Creek moved on. St. Jude's continued its services. New clergy were assigned to the region. The monastery remained locked. Its once vibrant garden, now a wild tangle of blackberry thorns and collapsed trellises. By spring, it had become folklore. Children dared each other to touch the rusted gates. Locals referred to the place with reverence or fear, but never both. The diocese filed a brief stating that the sisters had elected to disband the monastery for personal spiritual reassessment and had been relocated under private circumstances. No forwarding addresses were given, no public statements were made, not even to their families. It wasn't until decades later that the truth would begin to unravel, when one of the missing nuns would break her silence and a hidden basement room beneath the chapel floor would be found by accident during an unrelated land reassessment. But that was years away. In 1993, all the town had were whispers, an unsigned letter, and an unanswered question. How do 7 women disappear from a holy place without a trace? And who decided their story should end? 25 years had passed since the gates of Our Lady of the Pines were locked shut, but the unease they left behind never quite faded. For Marcy Delano, now a meticulous public records analyst for Clatsop County, Oregon, that unease was personal. Her godmother, Sister Helena, had once whispered bedtime stories to her about angels hiding in pine trees and the silence between prayers. As Marcy flipped through digitized files in the county's dusty archive basement in 2018, those stories suddenly didn't feel like metaphors anymore. It began with a curiosity-driven detour. She wasn't officially assigned to reopen any closed cases, but the closure of the monastery remained one of Alders Creek's few historical anomalies. It wasn't marked as a missing persons case, no court records, no lawsuits, not even a finalized death notice. Only a tangle of land ownership transfers and a medical file left hanging. Marcy's first unexpected discovery came from the town's now defunct community health clinic's archives, donated to the county by the last surviving doctor before he passed away in 2011. Among the patient logs was a set of routine physical examinations listed under Our Lady of the Pines, August 12, 1993. The file included 6 completed intake forms: Sisters Helena, Irene, Beatrice, Claire, Magdalena, and Ruth. Their checkups were uneventful, vital signs, minor issues of fatigue, a case of arthritis. But there was no record for Mother Superior Miriam. The blank space on the appointment sheet was oddly formalized with a dash and a note in pencil. There was no follow-up appointment. No explanation. A quarter-sense relative seemed louder than any presence. Marcy read the physician's notes twice. A line from Sister Irene's file stood out. Sister appears anxious, requests blood pressure taken twice, reports poor sleep, no appetite. The entry ended with a scribble she could barely read. Says things changing soon. That phrase clung to her like a shadow. If things were changing soon, why was there no record of a transition? No applications for reassignment. No notices filed with the diocese? Curiosity led her to cross-reference the land parcels surrounding the monastery. The coordinates matched Parcel 22B, Pinecrest Extension, which had belonged to the Catholic Diocese of Portland for over 5 decades. But then a record caught her eye. In late July 1993, less than 3 weeks before the monastery closed, ownership had been discreetly transferred to a registered nonprofit organization called Bethany Renewal. The file was thin, too thin. Just a single notarized deed, signed in Eugene, Oregon, filed by a third-party law office. No public hearing, no environmental review, no press release. It was as if someone had tried to slide the land under a closed door. Marcy followed the trail. Bethany Renewal had no website. The mailing address led to a locked P.O. box in Salem. The Articles of Incorporation described the organization as a faith-based wellness retreat promoting rest and spiritual transformation for clergy in need. No names were listed under the governing board, only a mail forwarding service as a contact point. The document was signed by someone named E. L. Harlow. She recognized that surname vaguely, but couldn't place it. Digging deeper, she found the law office that filed the transfer, now long closed. A single surviving partner, now retired, still lived near Portland. Marcy called, under the guise of historical land use study. The man, Thomas Brayburn, sounded surprised, but cooperative. "Yes, I remember that file," he said after a pause. "Strange case. We were asked to expedite. Everything was prepaid. I never met the client. All documents were sent via courier." When asked if he recalled the name Harlow, he responded carefully. "It wasn't the first time I saw that name on clergy transfers. There was a Reverend Elias Harlow tied to a wellness trust. Might be the same one. Might not." The pieces weren't connecting. They were orbiting each other, out of reach, like satellites of an event too carefully engineered to leave a straight line. But there was one more thing. Marcy returned to the county registry office, requesting all planning permits or structural reviews related to Personal 22B between 1992 and 1994. The clerk, a woman named Sharon with a memory like a filing cabinet, pulled an old microfiche and scanned the records. "Here," she said, tapping the screen, "request for zoning exemption, July 5, 1993. Applicant listed as Bethany Renewal. Reason cited confidential transitional housing for religious persons in spiritual distress." Marcy leaned closer. "Was this approved?" Sharon shook her head. "It was marked pending, then withdrawn 2 weeks later. The dates aligned too perfectly. The withdrawal came right around the medical visit. Whatever transitional housing was planned, it never made it into public record. Perhaps it didn't need to. Perhaps it had already taken place, in silence, under duress, and with no intent to inform." That night, Marcy sat in her apartment, the rain clawing at the windows like the pines once clawed at the monastery's brick walls. She laid out the pieces on her dining table, copies of the medical records, the deed, the zoning file, the odd notation in Sister Irene's chart. She highlighted one sentence in red ink: "Mother Superior Miriam did not attend." There was no trace of her in any other file. No property signature, no medical visit, no forwarding address. The woman who led 7 devout women into the woods and into a vanishing act had left no footprint. And yet something about that absence felt orchestrated, like a deliberate silence held in place by pressure no one had the right to exert. Marcy stared at the phrase, spiritual distress, wondering who had labeled it and who had paid to erase what came after. A single question formed in her mind as clearly as the storm outside. Who, exactly, was Bethany Renewal helping, and who were they hiding? The envelope had yellowed with time, its seal long broken and its contents folded neatly inside, like a secret too patient for the world. Marcy Delano found it in a box labeled, "Childhood, do not throw away," tucked beneath a stack of 4th-grade report cards and summer camp photos. The handwriting was unmistakably her mother's. Elegant, slightly slanted, a kind of calm desperation etched into each stroke. She had read this letter before countless times as a girl, but never truly understood it. Now, as a 35-year-old woman revisiting her childhood bedroom during a holiday visit to her aging foster father's house, she noticed something she hadn't seen back then. In the margin, faint and nearly erased, was a line written in a different pen. "Believe me, sweetheart, I didn't choose to leave." Believe me, I didn't choose to leave. That single sentence unraveled everything. Marcy had always known she was adopted. Her foster parents had been open about it. "Your mother was a good woman," they said, "a nun. She couldn't raise you, but she wanted you safe." That explanation had sufficed when she was 10. It did not suffice now. She had always believed her mother willingly relinquished her role, stepping away from the convent to place her in the care of others. But this letter suggested the opposite. It hinted not at surrender, but at force. Not at peace, but at concealment. And suddenly, the shadow of that locked monastery, the one whispered about in Alders Creek like a haunted myth, returned to her in vivid detail. She cleared her calendar. She requested time off work. She packed up the files she'd been assembling ever since the land deed search months earlier and began treating her private interests like a professional assignment. She created a timeline, plotted names, dates, anomalies. She returned to the county archives and filed a FOIA request with the Oregon State Records Office. But it wasn't until she pushed deeper, beyond land deeds and health forms, that she found a faint but chilling crack in the foundation. A file coded in the Attorney General's registry under Religious Nonprofit Inquiries, 1996. It referenced Bethany Renewal. It took 2 weeks to unseal the file. Most of it had been deemed inactive, but a few scanned memoranda had been left in the system. The documents were fragmented and dry, full of bureaucratic language and redacted names, but one phrase appeared multiple times: unauthorized funding for spiritual reorientation initiatives. Marcy reread the phrase, cross-corrected against known programs, and came across a report authored in 1996 by the Department of Charitable Oversight. It cited Bethany Renewal as one of 5 organizations flagged for unregistered counseling retreats aimed at clergy and religious orders facing ideological divergence. One paragraph in particular made her pulse quicken. Multiple complaints were submitted between 1995 and early 1996, alleging coercive psychological interventions under the guise of spiritual rehabilitation. While investigators found insufficient admissible evidence to pursue litigation, internal communications suggest procedural inconsistencies and use of unlicensed practitioners. Closure recommended under lack of actionable data. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen. Spiritual rehabilitation, ideological divergence. These weren't words used for grief counseling or silent retreats. These were euphemisms like transitional housing in the zoning document. The language was designed to obfuscate, to provide the veneer of care while masking the mechanics of control. Marcy traced the names of the whistleblowers in the appendix. All anonymous, all unresolved. But one internal memo caught her attention. It noted a failed follow-up visit to a closed property north of Alders Creek due to jurisdictional ambiguity, with ecclesiastical holding. There it was again, the land that once held the monastery. The property had changed hands, but its shadow remained rooted in every corner of this mystery. Feeling a mix of dread and clarity, Marcy dug into nonprofit tax disclosures from the 90s. Bethany Renewal had only filed IRS Form 990 once, 1995, then went silent. The only listed expense over $5,000, 0 cents that year, was labeled Facility, Retrofit, and Medical Transport Compliant. The recipient was Orion Specialty Logistics, a company dissolved in 1998, its records swallowed by time. She called the Secretary of State's office to request archival scans. The response came 3 days later. Orion was incorporated by an E.L. Harlow, the same name that had appeared on the deed transfer. Her heart pounded. She scribbled the name across her notes and drew a red circle around it. It was the third time Harlow appeared, once on the deed, once on the nonprofit articles, now as a fund recipient. No public record linked this person to a church, a parish, or a charity. He existed only in documentation. No photos, no interviews, no trace of a real biography. She was starting to feel watched. That was paranoia, surely, but twice now she had logged into her session already active. Her email had asked her to reinstallate active. Her home router blinked out mid-research for no clear reason. She stopped saving to the cloud. She began handwriting notes again. But nothing unsettled her more than what happened the morning she requested archived phone logs from the Diocese of Portland, officially as part of her historical outreach initiative. She received a voicemail that afternoon from an unlisted number. A man's voice, calm but firm. "Let sleeping faith lie, Ms. Delano. There are no more answers there. No threats, no inflection, just finality." She didn't respond. She didn't tell anyone. But she started locking her door at night and leaving the hallway light on. She reviewed the note from her mother again, this time tracing her fingers across each syllable, pressing down on the ink as if to extract truth from the page. She didn't choose to leave. It wasn't just a goodbye, it was a warning, and now that Marcy had stepped past that threshold, she knew there would be no turning back. Snow hadn't yet melted from the curbside edges of Portland when Marcy stepped off the Max Light rail and walked toward a red brick building cloaked in ivy and silence. St. Emmerich's Residence, a retirement home for clergy on the outskirts of the city. The place smelled faintly of incense and ammonia, a collision of the sacred and the sterile. She had come to meet Father Alban Huff, a retired priest in his late 80s, known for his photographic memory and, more importantly, his once close association with the diocese during the early 90s. She had called ahead, identifying herself as a historical researcher and former goddaughter to Sister Helena. The receptionist hadn't batted an eye. Father Huff, it turned out, still welcomed visitors, provided they were punctual and polite. Marcy sat across from him in a small sunroom filled with dying orchids and cracked vinyl cushions. His gaze was sharp, despite the tremor in his hands and the slowness of his breath. "You said Helena Delano?" he asked, his voice a whisper of gravel. "She was one of the 7, wasn't she?" Marcy nodded. "I'm her daughter. Adopted, but yes." The old priest took a slow sip of tea before setting it down with care. "She was good, thoughtful, but she followed Miriam." Marcy leaned forward. "Mother Superior Miriam, what do you mean following?" Father Huff looked at her, his eyes narrowing, like someone testing how much he should share. "Miriam had Opinions, not dangerous but defiant. She didn't like the direction the diocese was pushing them toward. Said we were being manipulated by financial interests. Said the church was replacing silence with systems. He paused, reaching into a folder by his side. Before she vanished, she tried to go through the proper channels. Wrote a complaint, sent it up to the chancery. Not the local parish, no, straight to the Archbishop's office. Accused the Vicar General of coercion. Marcy felt her breath catch. Coercion to do what? He smiled faintly, but there was no amusement. To transform the monastery into something more marketable, more therapeutic, they said. They wanted to integrate mental wellness frameworks into the monastic routine, something they claimed would make the order eligible for federal partnership grants. He tapped the side of his head. Bethany Renewal was the first to pitch the idea, said they could help reshape convent life into a model of spiritual clinical care. Miriam refused, wrote a letter. I saw it. She accused them of threatening to cut funding if she didn't comply. Marcy asked if he had a copy. He shook his head. I did once. I gave it to someone else to keep safe. A young archivist at the Portland Diocesan Library. She left her post the year after. The conversation lingered in Marcy's thoughts long after she left the residence. Her mother hadn't vanished into obscurity. She had resisted something. She had raised her voice in protest, and someone, maybe many, had moved quickly to ensure that voice was never heard again. But the idea that Bethany Renewal wasn't just a third-party nonprofit, but an instrument endorsed, or at least tolerated, by senior clergy, opened a darker implication. The church might have facilitated its own silencing mechanism. Driven by that suspicion, Marcy returned to the Portland Public Library, specifically to the Regional Grant Archive collection. It was tucked away in a back room that smelled of dust and forgotten ambitions. There, amid stacks of microfilm and early PDF printouts on dot matrix paper, she found what she wasn't sure she was looking for: a grant proposal filed in April 1992, stamped by the Oregon Community Mental Health Fund, submitted not by the diocese, but directly by Our Lady of the Pines Monastery. The author was listed as C.M. Mother Miriam, and the proposal outlined a request for $120,000, 0 cents in funding, to retrofit portions of the monastery into a restorative retreat for women experiencing trauma within religious settings. The language was clinical, precise, and compelling. It described the need for seclusion, therapy, informed spiritual mentorship, and secure housing for those suffering from post-abuse symptoms. Nowhere did it mention oversight by the diocese. In fact, in a margin note written in pen and later scanned into the archive, a reviewer had scribbled, "No Episcopal endorsement, flag for legal." This was a revelation. Not only had the sisters tried to break away administratively, they had sought independent funding to provide sanctuary to women damaged by institutions like the one they themselves belonged to. And someone, somewhere, had tried to shut it down before it ever reached public attention. Marcy dug deeper into the proposal's follow-up status. The funding was denied, officially due to duplication of services already in place through ecclesiastical health outreach programs. But one email chain buried at the back of the scanned file, between a program officer and a senior analyst, revealed something far more sinister. Was advised informally to deprioritize. Received call from vicar's office expressing concern over unregulated religious reform models, recommending closure. The walls were tightening. Mother Miriam had attempted to document a shift within the church, one from spiritual care to institutional image control, and she had paid for it with her disappearance. Marcy's mind returned to the blank health appointment, the unmarked truck, the sudden land transfer, the sealed complaint. All of it formed a spiral, and at the center was not a miracle or a tragedy, but a management decision. Control the narrative, silence the opposition, rebrand the institution. She took out her notebook and wrote one name at the top, Vicar General Thomas R. Nevin. He had been the acting head of regional ecclesiastical affairs in Oregon during the early 90s. If anyone had pulled the strings behind the scenes, it was him. She searched his name in the public archive and found that he had retired in 2002, moved briefly to Arizona, then disappeared from any active clerical roles. No photos, no memoirs, no interviews, just silence. the kind of silence that followed a cover-up. Marcy flipped the page and began sketching a flowchart. At the top, Mother Miriam, Plotzletter, Vicar Nevin, Bethany Renewal, Transfer. In the middle of the page, she drew a red circle around a phrase from the grant application, Spiritual Trauma Containment. That wasn't a retreat. That was a quarantine. And suddenly, the missing link wasn't just what happened to the nuns, it was what they were about to expose. There was a particular kind of heaviness that settled in Marcy's chest whenever she stepped back into Alders Creek, like the air itself carried an unspoken accusation, a collective amnesia that she alone refused to participate in. After uncovering the denied grant application and the potential suppression of Mother Miriam's protest, Marcy knew the next step had to take her back to the physical heart of it all, the monastery grounds themselves. The building remained locked and visibly decayed, but the town record showed it had not been demolished or repurposed. It stood frozen in time, a mute witness. Marcy submitted a request for structural archives under a preservation engineer who had worked on a quiet renovation of the property in mid-1993, listed only as internal structural reinforcement for security purposes. His name was Ellis Dunn, and he lived just 2 towns over. Dunn was reluctant at first, but when Marcy mentioned the monastery by name and referenced the year, his face changed. He motioned for her to sit at the kitchen table while he poured black coffee into mismatched mugs. "I never liked that job," he said, after a long pause. "Too many locked doors, too many questions we weren't allowed to ask." He recounted how he and his small crew were hired to modify part of the monastery's lower level, specifically to reinforce the southern quadrant of the basement, which had previously been used for storage. The request was unusual. They were to construct 2 enclosed rooms within the larger foundation chamber, with walls double-insulated, no windows, and a single steel reinforced door for each. Dunn had asked whether it was for security, a panic shelter perhaps, but the foreman, a man subcontracted from an out-of-state firm, told him to build as drawn and not inquire. The materials were expensive: specialized, soundproof insulation used in recording studios, vibration-dampening floor panels, and industrial locks typically found in psychiatric wards. What stood out to Dunn, however, was the mood of the place. The nuns never came near the work, he said, except for one, an older woman, quiet, always watching from the far end of the hallway. She never spoke to us, but her eyes never left the blueprint. He believed that was Mother Miriam, though he never heard her name. When the project was completed, they were paid in cash through a law office in Eugene and instructed not to document the renovation in the town's permit log. Dunn, being meticulous, had kept a copy of the original design sketch in his personal folder, out of habit, labeled Basement Edition. "No vent?" one asked the point. Marcy took the paper with both gratitude and rising unease. If these rooms were not meant for standard use, then what purpose did they serve? And if soundproofing and steel doors were necessary, who or what were they meant to contain? She remembered the line from the grant proposal, restorative retreat for women experiencing trauma. Were these rooms meant for care or for silence? She carried that question with her when she traveled next to the county legal office, hoping to unearth administrative correspondence from 1993. There she met a former legal aide named Ruthane Fields, who had worked under the district clerk during that period. Now retired but still sharp, Fields recalled handling documents submitted from the Our Lady of the Pines Monastery that summer, notably one that had caused a stir internally. It was a declaration, she said, adjusting her glasses, signed by all 7 sisters, requesting formal disaffiliation from the archdiocese. They stated a desire to operate as an independent faith-based community service entity under civil status. Marcy asked what had happened to the petition. "It never reached court," Fields replied. "The clerk received a memo from the diocesan council instructing ecclesiastical privilege and internal adjudication. The folder was hand-delivered back to the archdiocese." Marcy leaned forward. "Do you remember what the cover letter said?" Fields closed her eyes as if trying to replay the scene. "It had a sentence that stayed with me. We seek not to renounce faith, but to reclaim its dignity among those it has failed." That sentence echoed through Marcy's thoughts long after she left the office. The sisters weren't abandoning the church, they were challenging its structure, demanding space to care for the wounded in ways the institution refused to acknowledge. They weren't just leaving. They were trying to create something new, something accountable, and someone had seen that not as a vision, but a threat. Back in her hotel room, Marcy laid out the growing puzzle. The timing was undeniable, the renovation in July, the legal petition in August, the physicals at the clinic shortly after, and the complete disappearance by October. It wasn't random, it was planned, orchestrated, approved from above, and implemented with precision. The monastery had become, in its final months, a battle site for control, not just of land or title, but of narrative, purpose, and truth. The women had tried to declare their own path and been forcibly erased from the institutional memory for doing so. She stared at the design sketch of the basement again, fingers trembling slightly. What had those rooms held in the weeks before the monastery was shuttered? Who had entered them, and who had never come out? The revelation of the unfiled petition and the purpose-built basement rooms left Marcy in a haze of dread and urgency, her thoughts increasingly consumed by a picture that was coming into view. Not in clean lines, but in shadows and outlines shaped by deliberate omission. The next name on her list was retired state investigator Milton Graber, who had worked briefly for the Oregon Department of Human Services in the early 90s, a role that bridged mental health regulation and faith-based institutional compliance. Through a mutual contact in the Public Archives Department, Marcy arranged a visit to his home in Roseburg, where the aging investigator lived with his wife and a worn-out German shepherd that barked once before settling at his feet. Graber was tall, hunched from years of disuse, but still carried the watchful silence of a man trained to observe more than he spoke. When Marcy asked him directly whether he had ever investigated the Our Lady of the Pines monastery, he didn't answer at first. Instead, walking to a dusty cabinet and pulling out a thick brown folder labeled only 1993 Q3, Private Inquiry. He laid it flat on the table and flipped it open. It wasn't called an investigation, technically, he said, for instructed to conduct a welfare assessment, an internal behavioral audit triggered by an anonymous concern routed through the Diocesan Health Commission. Marcy listened without interrupting as he explained that he and a female clinical advisor had been sent to Alders Creek in mid-August, just weeks before the sisters vanished. The pretext was a report of internal strain and signs of destabilization within a monastetic community, with references to erratic routines, sleep deprivation, and ideological divergence. Their mandate was simple: assess whether continued operation posed any risk to the individuals or the public. Graber remembered entering the monastery under tight supervision. They were quiet, not hostile, he said, but guarded. Not one of them looked me in the eye for more than a second. He reviewed their daily schedule and interviewed 4 of the sisters briefly, though the Mother Superior was absent, away on ecclesial retreat, he had been told. The sisters described long hours, administrative confusion, and pressure from diocese's officials to alter their mission. Some of their answers seemed rehearsed. One, Sister Beatrice, had mentioned not being allowed to sleep in her room anymore and referenced a new practice of silence not shared with the outside. When Graber submitted his final assessment, it included a recommendation for temporary wellness retreat under medical supervision, citing signs of chronic exhaustion, systemic control dynamics, and vulnerability to psychological overload. He used institutional phrasing, but his meaning was clear. They were being targeted for removal under the guise of care. The request went up the chain, he said. I never heard what happened after that. Marcy asked if he still had his copy of the report. He shook his head. It was absorbed into a private diocesan archive in late '93. I kept a summary draft, but even that felt dangerous for years. Back at her apartment, Marcy reread the words chronic exhaustion and controlled sweat gather at the base of her spine. This wasn't mental illness. It was manufactured collapse. She dug through her folders and opened an encrypted email she'd received the week before from a woman using the alias Jane Hart, who claimed to be a former social worker tied to a confidential patient recovery program in Montana. At first, Marcy had assumed it was a hoax, but now, with Graber's account fresh in her mind, she clicked the attachment titled SRF7 Intake and observation. It was a heavily redacted intake report from a religious psychiatric facility called Sanctum Ridge Fellowship, located in a remote valley outside Missoula. The document, dated January 1994, referenced the arrival of 7 female clients from an undisclosed religious entity described as emotionally destabilized, presenting signs of collective disassociation and strong group identity cohesion with delusional moral framing. The patients were said to have exhibited reluctance towards standard therapeutic engagement and resisted administrative structures not aligned with original spiritual schema. Marcy's breath hitched as she read further. Physical descriptors matched the sisters exactly, ages between 40 and 70, references to chronic joint pain, even a mention of one individual experiencing phantom bell auditory hallucinations, which immediately reminded her of Sister Helena's note about bells heard during prayer. One line in the document made her physically recoil. Client 6 refused to sign behavioral agreement form, segregated to Room B. Room B, the very designation from the blueprint in the monastery basement. The same terminology, the same number of occupants. It was no longer speculation. The rooms had not been a theoretical precaution or architectural overreach. They had been part of a transition pipeline, a holding zone before transfer. What Graeber had called temporary wellness retreat had, in fact, become long-term internment in a rebranded spiritual asylum, carefully cloaked in religious terminology to avoid regulatory exposure. The final paragraph of the report chilled her. Clients are to remain under voluntary therapeutic cloister until determination of cognitive realignment or administrative clearance for community reintegration. No external contact authorized. Voluntary? But who defined that? Who approved it? Who signed off on making these women disappear behind doctrine walls and fluorescent lights in a place no one could trace? Marcy wrote the facility's name in capital letters on her notebook and circled it twice. If Sanctum Ridge had housed them, someone there still knew the truth. But even more pressing was a deeper realization. This had never been about faith or theology. It had always been about control, about muting dissent within a structure that could not afford the appearance of internal division. The sisters had threatened a fragile equilibrium. So, a system had moved, quietly, professionally, and completely, to isolate the virus before it could speak. The roads that led to Missoula felt longer than the map suggested, lined with frost-bitten fields and radio silence broken only by static and the occasional country sermon. Marcy drove with the documents spread out on the passenger seat, highlighted printouts from the Montana Department of Health and Human Services, 3 amended birth certificates, each listing a legal name change filed between 1995 and 1998 under the category Identity Protection and Spiritual Reintegration. All 3 names matched no known relatives in state databases, but their birth dates aligned exactly with 3 of the missing nun, Sisters Beatrice, Magdalena, and Ruth. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was concealment, wrapped in legal language, validated by signatures, and filed through channels designed never to be questioned. Marcy spent days tracing the identities. One had passed away in 2009, another lived under full guardianship at a Catholic rehabilitation home with no outside contact permitted. The third, however, had a public employment record. Her name now was Irene Shaw. She was a licensed practical nurse, working at Golden Pines Senior Care, less than an hour from where Sanctum Ridge had once operated before its sudden closure in 2002. Golden Pines sat on the edge of a flat plain, its signage faded, the front doors flanked by chipped statues of St. Joseph and of Virgin Mary, who had lost both hands to time. Marcy entered the lobby under the pretense of scheduling long-term care options for a relative, but her real aim came into focus the moment she spotted the nurse with salt-gray hair pinned neatly and eyes that flicked toward her with more calculation than concern. Marcy knew it was her, no DNA required. It was in the posture, the careful avoidance of eye contact, the way she folded her hands when she spoke, as though muscle memory hadn't forgotten the rosary. The first few questions were cordial, standard. The woman introduced herself as Nurse Shaw, offered a printed brochure, explained visiting hours, but when Marcy asked if she had ever lived in Oregon, something shifted. A brief pause, a blink too slow. "No," she said. "Born and raised here." Marcy let it go. For now. Over the next week, Marcy returned under varying pretenses, first to drop off insurance papers, then to inquire about dietary needs, and finally just to sit in the common room and observe. It wasn't long before one of the aides, young, well-meaning, confided that Nurse Shaw has no family visits, never leaves town, and doesn't talk about her past, but she's always calm, too calm. On the 7th day, Marcia returned to directly during a lunch break. No more pretext, just truth. "My name is Marcy Delano. I believe you knew my mother, Sister Helena." For a long moment there was no sound. Then the tray in Nurse Shaw's hand tilted slightly before she caught it, steadying herself with a deep breath. She didn't speak, not yet. Simply turned and walked away. Marcy waited in the parking lot until her shift ended. When she emerged, they stood in silence near the lot's edge, the sun sinking behind a row of skeletal trees. "You shouldn't be here," the woman said, eyes scanning the horizon. "They check," Marcy asked softly. "Who?" The woman didn't answer directly. The ones who made sure we stayed changed. New names, new habits, new silence. Marcy held up the folded printout of the amended birth certificate. "Your sister Ruth. You took care of the garden. You once wrote in a journal that plants grow where they're left alone. You signed a petition. You fought to stay free." The woman's face cracked then, not in pain, but exhaustion. She nodded slowly. "That's who I was." They sat on a bench behind the building, shielded from the cameras. Marcy let her speak on her own time. "They told us we were sick," she finally said we had been infected by ideology, that we misunderstood our place, that our community was spiraling into something dangerous. Her voice faltered. "They offered us a path, treatment, quiet, no judgment, no decisions, just room to forget. Some of us did, others couldn't." She looked directly at Marcy now. "We didn't get to choose. They said it was to protect the faith, but it wasn't. It was to silence the questions. The votes. The desire to break from the hierarchy. Miriam tried. She really did. But once she filed that letter, we were already ghosts." Marcy asked what happened to the others. "3 of us stayed here. 1 is gone. The rest, I don't know. They separated us early on. We were given new prayers, new work. The days blurred. I remember a room, no windows, a light that never turned off, and a man in clerical gray who said, 'You are being given mercy.'" She trembled slightly, but it felt like burial. It was from the monastery's last group portrait at the farmer's market. The woman took it, hands shaking, and stared at it for a long time. "That was the last day we went outside," she whispered. "They came the night after. I remember the truck. No plates, just hands on our backs. And silence." Marcy asked if she would go on record. The woman looked away. "They still have reach, even now. You'll see. If you look too long, they'll find you. Or make you someone else." The next time Marcy arrived at Golden Pines, she was met not by the usual quiet nod from the front desk, but by a small package left with the receptionist. "From Irene," the young aide whispered, her eyes darting around as though the act itself breached an unspoken boundary. The box was small, aged, and wooden, its corners smoothed by time and the oils of careful hands. On the underside, a faint carving read, Marty took it with both hands, heart drumming a steady rhythm of dread and reverence. She waited until she was back in her motel room before opening it. Inside were 6 envelopes, each worn, each bearing no stamp, no recipient address, only names written in familiar, graceful cursive. They were letters, unsent, preserved, each one addressed to a relative, a friend, or in one case, simply, to the one who still remembers me. The pages were fragile, but the ink remained clear, except for certain portions smudged by what looked like tears or hurried erasure. Marcy read them in silence, one by one. The first, from Sister Beatrice to her brother in Nebraska, began with hesitation, as if she weren't sure the letter would ever be sent. "They say this is not confinement. They say this is protection. But I no longer know the difference." She described being taken from the monastery under medical concern, driven for hours in silence, arriving at a compound with high fences and padded walls. She spoke of therapy sessions led by clergy, not clinicians, and of being told repeatedly that her memory was tainted by false righteousness. In closing, she wrote, We signed something, a form called Temporary Medical Shelter Consent. They said if we agreed, we'd be safe, that later, maybe, we'd return to our calling. But what is a calling if you must barter for it with silence? The second letter from Sister Magdalena was addressed to a niece she had helped raise. Her words were more defiant. "Do not let them tell you I chose this. I was made to believe resistance would bring harm not to me, but to the others. I signed for their sake. They used that. They know how to make guilt feel like consent." The third letter, from Sister Ruth, was torn at one edge. The writing halted mid-sentence, resumed in smaller, tighter script, as though she feared discovery while writing it. "Every morning we are told we are healing, but healing implies a wound. What if the only wound is this silence?" The fourth letter, written in bold strokes, was from Sister Clare, who had always been known for her candor. She didn't hide her bitterness. "They said we were dangerous because we dreamed aloud, because we believed obedience could coexist with inquiry. They call this place a haven. It is a vault. They have buried us under the language of care." The fifth, from Sister Helena, Marcy's mother, was the one that made her hands tremble. "I have thought of you every day, my child. They said writing this letter would help me let go, but I write it because I cannot. Not of you, not of truth. They say my silence is a sign of recovery. Then I will never be well." Marcy clutched the page to her chest, as if the words could collapse time, restore what had been stolen. But it was the sixth letter that held the line which chilled her to her core. It was unsigned, but clearly written by Sister Irene, the woman now known as Nurse Shaw. In it she recounted the early weeks of their confinement, the segregation of those who refused to comply, and the growing fear among the sisters. Then came the line, written not in black ink like the rest, but in red, jagged strokes. "Sister Agnes refused. She would not sign. They took her somewhere else. We never saw her again." The rest of the page was blank. Marcy sat in stunned silence. Sister Agnes had been the youngest of the group, outspoken. She had been the one who suggested the grant proposal, the one who kept records. If she resisted, if she had refused to sign, then where had they taken her? Was she alive? Was she buried beneath another name? Or was her refusal the final threat that the system had to eliminate? The letters were more than emotional farewells. They were confessions of coercion, documentation of psychological manipulation under the banner of care. And perhaps most tellingly, they were never meant to reach anyone. Marcy realized the box had survived only because someone had hidden it, perhaps with the hope that someone would come looking. Someone like her. She spread the pages out across the bed, photographed each one, and uploaded the images to an encrypted archive. These voices would not be lost again. She read the red-inked line once more, her eyes catching on the last two words, "Never again." It wasn't just about Sister Agnes anymore. It was about all of them. And the network that had created this silence was larger, older, and more deliberate than she had feared. Marcy couldn't sleep. The letters, their jagged truths and soft pleading phrases, haunted every breath she took. She found herself staring at the ceiling of her dim motel room, tracing every turn of the story so far, like mapping a wound. But it wasn't until she cross-referenced the dates again that she saw it, an inconsistency hiding in the bureaucratic haze of old forms and redacted files. Her mother, Sister Helena, had been officially recorded as deceased in an administrative health notice filed through a church-affiliated medical liaison office dated March 1994, 6 months after the documented vanishing of the 7 nuns. But what stood out, beyond the delay, was what was missing. No death certificate issued by the state, no coroner record, no obituary, no burial listing. Just one line, almost mechanical: deceased, non-pragmatic, unconfirmed external review, status closed. Marcy printed the document and stared at it, heart racing. How could a death be logged with no confirming evidence, no family notification, no physical body? The answer was simple and damning. It couldn't, unless someone had made it that way. This wasn't just disappearance, this was erasure. And her mother's name wasn't at the bottom of the chain, it was at the very center. Desperate for answers, she arranged one more visit to Golden Pines under the pretext of returning paperwork. Nurse Shaw, Sister Ruth, met her outside again, this time with visible hesitation. "They're aware you're still digging," she whispered. "There's been noise, questions at the diocese. You need to stop." But Marcy shook her head. "There's no one left to speak for her, just me." Ruth looked away, eyes glassy. Then asked, carefully. It wasn't Ruth who gave her the final piece, but another woman, a former nun still living under care in a private wing of the facility, barely coherent most days. Her name, recorded simply as M. Dalton, had once been Sister Magdalena. With Ruth's silent nod, Marcy was allowed to visit her in a small sunlit room lined with dusty crucifixes and dried lavender. Magdalena barely looked up at first, muttering scripture under her breath, rocking slowly, but when Marcy held out a photograph, Helena in her habit, standing near the monastery's vegetable beds, something in Magdalena's eyes sharpened, her fingers twitching. "She stayed," the old woman murmured. "She wouldn't say yes." Marcy leaned closer. "What happened to her? Did she try to escape?" Magdalena shook her head. "She fought too long. When they brought the papers, she tore hers, said the vow of silence was not meant for lies. They warned her, said refusal would mean extended care, said she would endanger the others if she resisted." Her voice dropped to a whisper. The last night before they took us, we heard it, behind the basement door. Crying, pleading." Marcy's throat tightened. "You heard her?" Magdalena's eyes closed slowly. "We weren't allowed to speak her name after, not even in prayer. They said she was being relocated, but we knew. Marcy left the facility shaken, the cold Montana wind slicing against her coat like accusation. She now knew that her mother had been alive for weeks, possibly months, after the others were taken. That she had been singled out, that the price of resistance had been not just disappearance, but silencing in its most brutal form. The falsified death notice was no clerical error. It was a decision, a stamp on a file meant to close a chapter that should never have begun. Back in her motel room, Marcy opened her laptop and stared at the document again. She scrolled to the signature field and saw only initials, ELL. She had seen them before, on the land deed transfer, the nonprofit funding log, and now here. E.L. Harlow, whoever he was, he had operated across every step of this process: property, funding, relocation, false record, a handler, a fixer. Maybe more, but always in the shadows, always when the system needed deniability. Her mother had refused to be part of the silence, and for that, someone had decided she no longer existed. Marcy picked up her phone and called the only contact who might still have a link to Harlow, an archivist in Eugene who had quietly helped her back in Phase 3. She left a voicemail. "I think I know who buried my mother. I need everything you can find on Edward L. Harlow. Every alias, every contract, and fast." She hung up and pulled the last letter from the wooden box, reading Helena's words once more. "I write because I cannot forget. Neither would she." The days that followed were a blur of photocopies, encrypted uploads, and email threads, with journalists who responded with cautious curiosity at first, then urgency, then resolve. Marcy had spent weeks preparing the dossier, compiling every piece of testimony, every scan of the hidden letters, every blurry photograph and audio recording into a single, linear timeline of systemic silencing. She attached the falsified death record, the floor plan of the basement, the intake form from Sanctum Ridge, and most importantly, the written statements from Sister Ruth and the final account from Sister Magdalena. She sent the entire archive to a seasoned local reporter at the Oregon Sentinel who had once covered clergy abuse cases and knew how to navigate the legal traps. The subject line read, "What happened to the Sisters of Alders Creek?" Within days, she was summoned for an interview. 2 weeks later, the Sentinel published a 3-part exposé titled "The Quiet Cloister, a System Buried in Silence," and the public response was immediate. What began as cautious outrage ignited into protest, then into action. The Diocese of Oregon issued a brief statement, initially calling the claims deeply concerning but largely unsubstantiated. That didn't hold. Under pressure from multiple advocacy groups and a mounting call for transparency, the Church was forced to release internal documentation previously sealed for decades. On March 10, 2021, exactly 28 years and 5 months after the disappearance of the 7 nuns, the Archbishop of Portland held a public press conference. His tone was rehearsed, legal, but his words changed everything. We acknowledge that in 1993, administrative measures were taken with regard to the Our Lady of the Pines Monastery that, while intended for safety and doctrinal unity, did not follow established canonical or civil protocols. These actions resulted in the unauthorized confinement, transfer, and silencing of several women of faith. We deeply regret the pain this caused. No names, no details. But a chink in the wall had opened, and for the first time in nearly 3 decades, the Church said aloud what it had long buried. Marcy did not attend the press conference. She was already planning something else, something older, more sacred. She worked quietly with local organizers to coordinate a memorial service at the ruins of the monastery grounds. Over the years, the structure had fallen into near consolidator, and one bell tower now tilting toward the earth like a broken metronome. Grounds had been declared unsafe, but the adjacent cemetery remained intact, its gates rusted but unlocked. Marcy chose September 14, 2023, 30 years to the day after the official closure of the monastery, to host the remembrance. There were no camera crews, no reporters, just candles, flowers, and the soft murmuring of names that had once vanished from every record. She stood before a modest plaque she had installed herself, engraved with 7 names: Helena, Beatrice, Magdalena, Ruth, Claire, Agnes, and Miriam, each one framed not by titles, but by the simple phrase. She chose to speak. The ceremony was brief, the sky overcast, and as the small crowd dispersed, Marcy remained behind, gathering the last of the candles and folding the chairs into her trunk. It wasn't until she turned back toward the cemetery gate that she saw the figure. A woman stood at the far edge, dressed in plain gray, her shoulders curved with age, but her stance steady. She moved slowly, methodically, stepping toward the plaque with a quiet reverence. Marcy's breath caught. For a moment she thought she might be imagining it, a ghost her mind had conjured from hope. But then the woman looked up, and Marcy knew. Her mother, Helena, alive, older, thinner, but unmistakable. Her eyes were the same, resolute, tender, filled with the gravity of things she had seen and never spoken of. She was not alone. Holding her arm, steadying her steps, was another woman, younger, sharper, eyes scanning the scene with a cautious protectiveness that made Marcy's knees weaken. Her reflection, her own features in another's skin. "It's her," Ruth had once said, years ago, whispering into silence. The last one. And here she was, defying the erasure, the falsified death, the decades of crafted amnesia. They walked the last few steps together. Marcy approached slowly, not sure whether to cry or kneel. Helena smiled, not with joy, but peace. She reached out, her hand trembling but firm, and touched the side of Marcy's face. "You did right," she said, her voice weathered and fragile. "No one makes me be silent now." There was no need for explanation, no recitation of what she had endured or how she had escaped the final erasure. She was here. That was enough. They stood in the breeze that wound through the crooked gravestones, 3 generations of survival shaped by silence, but no longer defined by it. Around them, the earth held its breath, not in fear, but in respect. Later that evening, long after the others had left, Marcy sat alone by the plaque, fingers tracing the name that had once only been a memory. She lit one final candle and placed it beneath the name Agnes, the only one never found, never confirmed. "For the one who never said yes," she whispered. Behind her, the old bell tower creaked softly in the wind, like a breath returning after years buried deep. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more true inspired mysteries like this one. I'm curious, what part of the story hit you the hardest? And where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment and let me know.